It may sound like overkill, but not doing this can ruin the entire beat. So this is how we made Mount Sinai. This is how we made Paris. So this is how we made Second Hand. And that's why effects like this are the most important characteristic of Suicide Boy type beats. Alright, what's good YouTube? So today I'm going to be going over how Suicide Boys, aka Scrim, make their signature horror themed beats. In this tutorial, I'm going to be going over how they create their melodies, their go-to VSTs, effects, as well as presets, how they make their drum patterns and their go-to drum kits, how they manipulate their samples, as well as some brief deconstructions of some of their beats as well as mine. By the way, if you want any of the drum sounds or samples that I use in this tutorial, there's a link in the description where you can download them completely free. So let's talk about melodies. Suicide Boys really have three types of beats that I categorized. The first would be mosh pit type beats, stuff like Mount Sinai, Paris, and Second Hand. The emotional sample based beats, stuff like To Those I Love, 122 Days, and Kill Yourself Part 3. And finally, there's the 3-6 Mafia based sample beats, stuff like All Dogs Go to Heaven, Omen, and Opana. In this tutorial, I'm not going to cover the emotional sample beats because they fall under the line of more XXX type stuff, which I'm surely going to cover eventually. But that being said, I'm going to focus more on mosh pit type beats and go briefly over the 3-6 Mafia type beats. I'm only going to go over these beats briefly because they're really just remakes. All they really do is put the same melodic and drum patterns over that beat, and then they add their own sounds to it to make it sound like it's theirs. So there isn't really much to cover there. So with that in mind, let's talk about VSTs. There's three main VSTs that Scrim is almost always using. They're Nexus 2, Electra X, and Omnisphere. 90% of the time though, Scrim is using Nexus for these types of beats. The reason for this is the presets in Nexus are all really well mixed, and they have various layers in each preset, so you don't really have to do any mixing. And the same thing goes for Electra X and Omnisphere. As for presets and banks Scrim uses, it's important to note that he doesn't use expansion pack sounds. He's really just using the default ones that you get in the VST. And the reason for that is the majority of sounds in these expansion packs are really just individual layers taken from these default presets being soloed out, so you don't really need them. And since we want to use heavily layered sounds, I'd say generally try and stay away from them. And for Omnisphere, they rarely use it, but when they do, it's almost always going to be for bell presets, specifically the generic ones like the In Memoriam preset, stuff like that. Now as for the melodies, they're about as generic as it gets in terms of trap melodies. Stuff like when making them, you want to stick to melodies with a lot of tension, as that's what's going to give you the evil vibe that you're looking for. And this is the most important thing to note. You want to use scales that have a lot of black keys, as those also give away evil vibes, specifically the C and D sharp minor scales, as they're used in practically every beat they make. Also, just to note, they don't really use chord progressions all that much. It's really just one basic melody. And finally, as for effects, they use a lot of reverb, as you're going to see through this tutorial. They also use a lot of gross beat, which helps a lot with these types of melodies because it gives a lot of rhythm, which is something that you lose when you use sounds with more reverb. Yeah, but apart from that, there's nothing complex going on here in terms of effects. So to emphasize on this, I'm going to break down some of the melodies that I mentioned earlier. So this is how we made Mount Sinai. The preset is from the Electra X Keys bank, and it's called Ariel's Ghost BT. As you can see in the melody, there's only one white key that plays in the entire thing, and it's in the D sharp minor scale. It also has this gross beat halftime effect with a slight change to the tail end. So the melody before the gross beat sounds like this. And with the gross beat, it sounds like this. This is how he made Paris. The preset he uses comes from this external Halloween bank from Nexus, and it's called Mystic Pluck. And this is the melody. It's literally just these 4 notes, and it sounds like this. Normally something like that wouldn't work because the beat would get really boring really quickly, but since they use a lot of effects and variations in the melodies and vocals, they managed to keep the beat interesting, which is something I'll go over later. So this is how we made Second Hand. All the same ideas apply to this beat. The preset comes from the Fantasy and Dream Nexus bank, and it's called SY Chill Zone 2. It's actually just one of the 3 layers soloed out of the beat. The original preset sounds like this. But with the sine sound soloed out, it sounds like this. And as for the scale, again, it's in a C sharp minor scale. And finally, this is how we made Magnolia. The preset comes out of the arpeggiator bank in Nexus. The preset is called AR Origin 1, and the arp is just turned off. And this is the melody, again, C sharp minor scale, and it sounds like this. So you get my point. For these types of beats, simple and repetitive melodies works. Okay, so let's talk about drums. The drums are the key thing to get right if you're trying to make a Suicide Boys type beat. First off, let's talk about the 808. The trend nowadays is to use the short Zaytoven type 808s and stick to higher tempos for your beats. But for Suicide Boys, you want to avoid that, as almost all the time they're using long stretched out 808s, usually with a lot of distortion. I'll link a few in the kit below if you want them. As for claps and snares, you want to use sharp and punchy snares. There's nothing wrong with using claps, but you want to make sure they're sharp because the bounce of Suicide Boy beats heavily relies on it. It's hard to explain in words, so I'll play you an example. As you listen, you can tell the difference. It's important to understand that every sound you use needs to have the same attributes as the beat, so we want really aggressive and loud sounds. And this doesn't just apply to the snares and claps, it applies to the 808s, the hi-hat rolls, and everything you use. Speaking of which, Scrim uses a lot of snare and hi-hat rolls in his beats, stuff like this. It's generally up to you where you put them. He really just has them all over the place playing throughout the beat. The general reason that he uses these types of sounds is that most Suicide Boy beats fall within the tempo ranges of like 104 to 130, which is a much slower tempo. And like I said in the up-tempo beat tutorial, slower beats usually require looser drum sounds, so it makes sense that they'd use these types of sounds in their beats. And these are the drum kits that Scrim uses. These types of drum kits have the perfect sounds for these 3-6 Mafia as well as mosh pit type beats, as they contain a lot of old school drum sounds as well as a lot of the essential trap drum sounds that you need for these types of beats. They also contain a bunch of 3-6 Mafia type samples, which are perfect for these types of beats, and as you can imagine, a lot of their songs feature samples that are from this drum kit. I'll link a few separate ones in the kit that you can mess around with. Also, really important side note that I forgot to mention, when making the 3-6 Mafia type beats that I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that the drum pattern is identical to the one that's playing in the sample, so don't be creating like a new snare and kick pattern from the one that's playing, because it will never work. Finally, for mixing their drums, they use a slight amount of reverb on their hi-hats, snares, along with a few subtle delays. But apart from that and just leveling your beats, there's nothing crazy that they're doing. One thing to note though is that when you're using reverbs like this on your drums, it's really important that if you're going to EQ them, that you do it before you put the reverb on, because if you don't, it's just going to sound both filtered and muddy, which is not what you want with your drum sounds. But that's it for the drums. Finally, let's talk about what I think is the most important thing to know for these types of beats, and that's effects. So as you can tell, their beats are super simple and repetitive and not in a good way, so you want to have a lot of effects and background sounds in your beat, as they can prevent that. So their most used sounds are really anything horror related. A lot of the times they have a lot of laughs that sit in the background, stuff like this. They also have a lot of risers and crash sounds, which help give the beat way more energy and signal to the listener when the beat is changing, so stuff like this. This effect is really easy to make. All you really need to do is clone the crash sound, drag it over, then reverse it. They'll also have a lot of ambient layers that just sit in the background. Stuff like old record crackling, rain, lightning, literally anything so long as it matches the vibe of the beat. I strongly recommend using the expand, ambience, and effects presets, as they have a lot of sounds that match these types of beats. Also, if you're using effects that have like bounce or tempo to them, stuff like laugh sounds, long phrases, or background rap samples that you hear in a lot of their beats, it's really important that you make sure that they're on time, because if they're not, they're just going to throw the artist off and ruin the beat. So just play them with the metronome and stretch them out until you match the tempo of the beat. And finally, the most important thing to know is that you need to tune your FX sounds. It may sound like overkill, but not doing this can ruin the entire beat. And I hear a lot of people not doing this as well, so make sure to do that. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to play a beat I made. Here's what it sounded like if I didn't use any effects. As you listen on its own, it sounds alright, but the lack of effects is really obvious because there's no energy in the beat and it just sounds bland overall. So this is what it sounds like with effects. So as you can hear, the effects in that beat just take it to a whole nother level and give it so much energy that it was originally lacking in the beat without them. And that's why effects like this are the most important characteristic of Suicide Boy type beats. And on a side note, for those who want to see it, this is how I made the melody for the beat. I just took this key preset from Electra X called Sad Piano, and I made this melody with gross beat on the entire time in the D sharp minor scale, and it sounds like this. All these things, like their use of like generic trap sounds, effects, and melodies really matches who they are. Because if you think of it, no like drug addict or some dude from like the hood is not going to be engineering their sounds, putting in like crazy research, adding all these layers, limiting, compressing, and doing all that stuff. So if you want your beats to sound like it was made by these types of guys, you need to make them how they would. So in a sense, these types of imperfections that you find in these types of beats are honestly what make them. But that's it for the tutorial. Once again, make sure to follow my Instagram at FinnaFinesse. Once I get those numbers up somewhere in the hundreds, I'm going to start giving away my drum kits, some sample packs, as well as VSTs, so go follow that. Let me know what you thought. If you have any ideas or video suggestions, let me know in the comments. Make sure to like, subscribe, and peace.
To you.